On November 17, 1990, a 17-year-old boy named Neil Stonechild was seen in the back of a Saskatoon police cruiser. His face was bleeding. His wrists showed marks consistent with handcuffs. The last words heard from him, by a witness who tried to speak to him through the car window, were, "They're going to kill me." 3 days later, Neil Stonechild was found frozen in a field on the northern outskirts of Saskatoon. The temperature had been -28 degrees Celsius. His body showed injuries inconsistent with simply being outside in the cold. The police investigation concluded he had been drunk and had wandered out of the city on his own. The file was closed. His family did not believe it. They were not believed. For 10 years, Neil Stonechild's death was officially an accident. Then 2 more Indigenous men were found frozen on the outskirts of Saskatoon in the winter of 2000. Then a survivor came forward and described being driven to the edge of the city by police and left there in the cold. And what had been one closed file became something that could no longer be explained as an accident. Neil Stonechild was Ojibwe. He was 17 years old. He lived in Saskatoon with his mother and was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a normal teenager, occasionally in trouble with the law for minor offenses, struggling with the particular difficulties of a young Indigenous man in a prairie city in 1990, but not someone whose death should have been unsolvable. The night of November 24, 1990, he was last seen alive in the Confederation Park neighborhood of Saskatoon. He had been at a party. He had been drinking. He had gotten into an altercation and a neighbor had called police. What happened between his last confirmed sighting and his death in a field north of the city has been the subject of 2 decades of investigation and inquiry. The original police investigation concluded within days that he had wandered away from the party while intoxicated, collapsed in the field, and frozen to death. The investigation did not interview the witness who had seen him in the police cruiser. It did not follow up on the injuries to his body. It did not explain how a 17-year-old from Confederation Park, a neighborhood far from the northern edge of the city, had come to be found dead in a field that was not easily accessible from where he had last been seen. The file was closed. Neil Stonechild's mother, Stella Bignell, never accepted the official account. She advocated for a proper investigation for years. She was not listened to. She died before the public inquiry that eventually confirmed her son had been taken there. Neil Stonechild's death might have remained a single, officially closed case if it had been isolated. It was not isolated. Within the Saskatoon Indigenous community, accounts had been circulating for years of a police practice of driving Indigenous men to the edge of the city in cold weather and leaving them there. The practice had a name in the community: Starlight tours. The term was sardonic, a forced trip to the outskirts of the city to see the stars, in weather cold enough to kill. Police denied it. The claims were not formally investigated. In the winter of 2000, 3 events in quick succession made the pattern impossible for the official record to continue ignoring. Rodney Neistas, 25, was found frozen to death in a field on the western outskirts of Saskatoon on February 3, 2000. Lawrence Wegner, 30, was found frozen in a similar location on February 24, 2000. Both men had been in contact with police shortly before their deaths. Both deaths were initially investigated as accidents. Then, in the same month, a 33-year-old Indigenous man named Darryl Knight was picked up by Saskatoon police, driven to a power plant on the city's outskirts, and dropped off in the cold. Unlike Stonechild, Neistas, and Wegner, Darryl Knight survived. He walked to the power plant, knocked on the door, was let inside, and eventually made his way home. He reported what had happened to him to police and to the RCMP. He was believed. The officers involved, Constables Dan Hatchin and Ken Munson, were charged with unlawful confinement, convicted, and sentenced to 8 months in prison. The convictions of Hatchen and Munson confirmed that at least one instance of the practice had occurred. The question was whether it was an isolated incident or a pattern. Saskatchewan Premier Lorne Calvert ordered a public inquiry, the Wright Commission, which reported in 2004. The inquiry examined the deaths of Stonechild, Neistas, and Wegner, and the Knight incident, as well as broader questions about police relations with the Indigenous community in Saskatoon. On the Stonechild case specifically, the inquiry found that the original investigation had been inadequate and that there was credible evidence that Stonechild had been in police custody on the night of his death. The inquiry identified two officers, Constable Larry Hartwig and Constable Bradley Sanger, as having been with Stonechild on the night he died. The inquiry recommended that their conduct be reviewed by the police service. The subsequent police review resulted in both officers being dismissed from the Saskatoon Police Service. Neither officer was charged criminally. The evidence that would have supported a criminal charge, establishing beyond reasonable doubt that they had driven Stonechild to the field where he died, was, by 2004, 14 years old. Witnesses had died. Memories had faded. The original investigation had been conducted in a way that was later found to have missed or ignored available evidence. The critical first days and weeks of the investigation, when the physical evidence and fresh witnesses might have established a criminal case, had been consumed by a conclusion that the official record had already decided. The dismissals of Hartwig and Sanger from the Saskatoon Police Service were appealed through the labor arbitration process. In 2008, an arbitrator reinstated both officers, finding that the evidence against them in the disciplinary proceeding did not meet the standard required for dismissal. The reinstatement was controversial. For the Stonechild family and for Indigenous community advocates, it represented a continuation of the official reluctance to hold police accountable for what had happened. For the officers and their union, it represented the proper application of due process in a disciplinary proceeding. The tension between these two positions, both of which have internal logic, is characteristic of the larger problem. The institutions designed to investigate police misconduct are not independent of policing culture. The evidentiary standards that protect individuals from wrongful dismissal in labor proceedings are the same standards that make historical cases of police misconduct extremely difficult to prosecute. The Wright Commission found credible evidence. The arbitrator applied a higher standard and found the evidence insufficient. Both outcomes followed from the frameworks they were operating within. None of this helped Neil Stonechild's family. None of it helped the families of Rodney Neistas and Lawrence Wegner, whose deaths were never prosecuted. None of it recovered the years during which the Indigenous community of Saskatoon knew what was happening and was not believed. Darrell Knight, Rodney Neistas, Lawrence Wegner, and Neil Stonechild are the documented cases. The question that has never been fully answered is how many undocumented cases there were. The practice described by Knight, being driven to the outskirts in cold weather and left, was sufficiently well known in the Indigenous community to have acquired a specific name long before it was investigated. Names do not attach themselves to isolated incidents. They attach to patterns. The RCMP investigation that followed Knight's 1999 complaint examined historical cases going back to 1976, looking for other incidents that might fit the pattern. That investigation concluded that Neistas and Wegner were the only confirmed additional deaths linked to the practice. What it could not establish was the number of men who had been taken out and left, survived the exposure, and never reported it, either because they did not believe a report would be taken seriously, or because they feared the consequences of reporting, or because the experience was, within the community, simply understood as a risk of being an Indigenous man in Saskatoon. The survivor who came forward, Knight, did so in the context of two contemporaneous deaths that gave his account a different kind of weight than a single report would have had. The accounting of what actually happened, across how many cases and over how many winters, has not been completed and cannot be completed now. The Starlight tours did not occur in isolation from the broader history of policing and Indigenous relations in Saskatchewan. Saskatoon in the 1990s had one of the highest rates of Indigenous incarceration of any city in Canada. Relations between the Saskatoon Police Service and the Indigenous community were, by any measure, deeply adversarial. Indigenous men were dramatically overrepresented in police interactions, in arrests, in charges, and in the criminal justice system generally. The specific practice of driving men to the outskirts existed within a broader culture in which the mistreatment of Indigenous men by police was normalized and rarely resulted in consequence. The Wright Commission made 12 recommendations, including improved police training, better oversight mechanisms, and enhanced Indigenous community consultation in policing decisions. Some of these recommendations were implemented. The fundamental power imbalance that made the Starlight tours possible, the combination of police authority, Indigenous social marginalization, and institutional reluctance to investigate police misconduct, was not resolved by any of them. In the years following the inquiry, the relationship between Saskatoon police and the Indigenous community improved in measurable ways. The specific officers implicated were removed, then reinstated. The structural conditions that had allowed it to happen were modified at the edges. The core of the problem, a police institution that had treated certain people's lives as disposable, has not been formally acknowledged by the institution itself. Neil Stonechild was 17. Rodney Neistas was 25. Lawrence Wegner was 30. They are remembered in different ways. Neil Stonechild's case, because of the length of the fight for acknowledgement and because of the specific credibility of the evidence against the officers named in the inquiry, has become the most documented and the most widely known. A book, Starlight Tour, by Suzanne Reber and Rob Renaud, documented the investigation in detail. Rodney Neistas and Lawrence Wegner are less often named, their cases less clearly resolved, their families less able to obtain the specific acknowledgments that might constitute something close to justice. There is a particular dimension of unresolved grief that attaches to cases where the what is known but the who and the full how are not. Families carry a knowledge that the formal record does not fully confirm. The knowledge that your son, or your brother, was left to freeze in a field by the people responsible for his safety, and that the people responsible were never criminally charged, exists in a space outside the official record. It is true. It is documented in ways that fall short of criminal conviction. And it has to be lived with. The families of Neistas, Wegner, and Stonechild have been living with it for decades. The city of Saskatoon has continued. The institution that produced those outcomes has continued. The field where Neil Stonechild was found is still there, north of the city, on the outskirts. The Starlight tours are a specific Canadian story, but the conditions that produce them are not unique to Saskatoon. The combination of Indigenous marginalization, police culture of impunity, inadequate oversight mechanisms, and institutional reluctance to investigate misconduct against Indigenous people exists across the country. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which reported in 2019, documented similar patterns of police failure in case after case, inadequate initial investigations, dismissive treatment of family reports, failure to connect cases that shared clear elements. The Wright Commission, in 2004, found the same patterns in the Stonechild investigation. The pattern is consistent. The specific consequences vary. In Saskatoon in the 1990s, the consequence was men dying of exposure in fields on the outskirts of the city. In other cities, in other decades, the consequences have been different, but the structural elements have been the same. Canada has not resolved this. The National Inquiry's finding of genocide, a finding that generated significant controversy and significant resistance from official channels, was the most direct official acknowledgement that the pattern constitutes something more than a series of individual failures. Whether that acknowledgement produces structural change is a question that is still being answered. Neil Stonechild was 17. He told someone they were going to kill him. He was right. The men responsible were never criminally charged. the institution that produced them continued. Canada has a pattern of this. Subscribe for more of the stories that the official record prefers to close without resolving. New story every week.